Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to begin episode 3 of this new segment, which is sort of like an intro to philosophy course. We're trying to get the big picture of philosophy, starting with the early big names. In episode 1, we did a quick overview of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. Episode 2 was Lao Tzu. And this one is Confucius. So let's bring in Mr. Etche Fatum, guide us through this knowledge. If you have questions you can be discussing in the chat, I will have the chat open during this. Let's rock it, let's roll it. Moving Mr. Etche Fatum into the channel. Welcome, Etche Fatum.
Hello?
Hello?
Hi.
Yo, yo, yo.
Got pretty late already, so I'll hope I'll be able to stay awake for long enough to cover all of Confucius's sayings, which are a lot.
He was a man of many words.
Yeah, he definitely was. How have you been?
Pretty solid. I have had a pensive couple days. Do you ever watch a show and it's a show that has some concepts that really challenge what it means to be a human person, and it kind of gnaws at you after you've watched it and stuff? That's what was happening to me the past couple days.
Yeah, that happened to me a lot. What was the show?
Parasite, the Maxim. I'm getting a tiny bit of echo from you, by the way. But
I'm not sure what that is about.
you might have me a little bit loud, or I may be on speakers. Yeah, I don't hear it now. Sweet.
Alright,
It's been
perfect.
fixed. But yeah, Parasite, it challenges a lot of the notions of the role of humanity on the earth relative to other living species and stuff, relative to other humans, acts of violence against other humans, against animals, cruelty in general. And it is established based on this species that invades and takes over humans and preys on them and stuff. And the main character and the companion character kind of evolving over the course of the show in a really interesting way. But it's pretty dark and heavy in terms of its tone. It doesn't really put humanity in the best light. It's kind of a critique. But it's a good one. I would recommend it.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. The view of humans as a parasite is very new, and it is not necessarily a nice thing to say about humanity, but I think it is an accurate description. We are pretty parasitic in our nature.
Well, one of the aspects that I think doesn't really have precedent is us escaping natural selection and booming in a way that no other species has done before. You could probably raise the question, if there was another species that had this happen to them, would they behave in a similar way? I would guess yes, just by virtue of life being focused on its own perpetuation first, usually. And then now we're kind of looking back on that and saying, okay, well, if we're destroying things as we're creating stuff, how do we streamline and fine-tune this process where we're not messing things up quite so bad?
There was a similar time in the Earth's history when, not sure whether it was plants or some kind of parasite or bacteria, started to produce oxygen and enriching the atmosphere with oxygen up to the, or close to the point where it is right now, and a lot died during that time. So I think it's the own interest of the species is what's prevailing, and we don't really care about other species getting destroyed in the wake of that.
Mm-hmm. The expanding sphere of moral concern.
Yeah, that is what we will be talking about. So a good segue into Confucius, basically. He talked a lot about, I want to start off by addressing a couple of short things that happened in chat last time. One of the things was I spoke about Nietzsche and him claiming Thus Spoke Zarathustra as his main work, which some people disagreed with and said he had many other interesting things to say, which is correct. But the claim that Zarathustra is the main work is from his basically when he was pretty old already. He wrote a book about all his other works, and he claimed Zarathustra to be the most important one in there. So that was his claim, not mine. Then there was a interesting discussion about in the Tao Te Ching. There was the passage about the sage and not doing things for reward. So there was a discussion in chat whether or not something that is not rewarding in a monetary sense could still be rewarding, like helping someone can be a reward in and of itself. And I wouldn't disagree with that. But basically the passage is more towards it doesn't matter whether there is reward or not. The reward shouldn't be the reason why you do it. So it's not whether there is a monetary reward or any other incentive to do it. The thing is, you should do it because it's the right thing to do, which we'll get back to when we talk about Confucius a lot. And then the third one was basically the what is truth and is it objective, is it subjective, and how to make truth claims when we really don't know anything about objective reality, which is a big discussion in and of itself, and I don't really want to go into that right now. But I think there's different degrees of truthfulness or different degrees of certainty, and we can work with that, and something is as truthful as the degree of certainty we have that it is reproducible, for example, an experiment.
Yeah, if you can replicate something or if you can collect mutually supporting evidence, then you could say its truth value increases.
Yeah. And then there was one nice YouTube comment saying that he likes the content, but he would like someone a bit more charismatic and with a better mic to do it. So yeah, I got a better mic.
Oh, you did? What do you have now? Or was that from the first episode?
That was from the first episode.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And that's all I can say about it.
Welcome to content creation, by the way. That's one of those really fun things of people will take different jabs and stabs at you. I had one YouTube comment that was pretty long, and it was about how I had become too growth focused as a broadcaster, and it was hard to watch me, so they weren't going to watch me anymore. It's one of those things where you may disagree with the premise of the comment, but you're going to get those. Welcome. Now we have some stuff in common. I know you stream, but the bigger you get, the more you're going to get hassled for random stuff.
Yeah, I can imagine. Luckily, we all have negativity bias, so if you get 100 positive remarks, as long as there's one negative, you gravitate towards that more so than you do towards the positive.
Yeah.
Yeah, so before I want to start getting into Confucius, I want to talk about why Confucius did what he did and why I kept asking about the whole nature versus nurture conversation, which always came down to it's both. And I want to talk why eugenics is a bad. One good indication is it has its own Cards Against Humanity card. That's usually an indicator for something not being a nice term. Eugenics being the selection of who we want to breed and who we don't want to breed. So basically in the whole nature versus nurture conversation we always said it's both. And I totally agree with that. The problem being that we're a lot more able to do things about the nurture part of people more so than the nature part, because not allowing people to breed has some negative connotations, to say the least. And that was what Confucius was about, how to ethically improve people. And it's something that also came up with Plato, it came up with Socrates, and to some degree came up in the Tao Te Ching as well. And yeah, so we returned to the vinegar tasters. We talked about the Tao Te Ching last time, the sweet interpretation of life, and we'll be talking about the sour interpretation now. And I found this nice little snippet from the movie about Confucius. It's a Chinese movie. And it's him meeting Lao Tzu, and you kind of see a little bit of their differences. It's about a minute long, so we can kind of get into what it means to, or how these two had a different outlook on the world, even though they agreed on a lot of things. And how basically Confucius was building on the Tao Te Ching for his philosophy. He was trying to look for practical implications on how to get people on the way.
Were we gonna watch the video?
Yeah, it's in the script, or I can link it in chat if you like.
Oh, I see it. I got the link. No problem. Hi. Okay. Here we go. Okay, let's do this. Is this better?
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about China, which these days is discussed almost constantly on television and in newspapers.
Video,
wait, are they still a thing?
So we used to put information on.
This is the wrong video?
We could. There's two of them.
Oh.
This is basically 2,000 years of Chinese history. We have someone else talk about it, having to talk about it myself. Wait, I'll send you the link in chat.
Got him. Confucius and Lao Tzu. Let's pause the lovely fire music. I like having the little crackle in the background while we're talking, though. It's some nice ambiance to it. Okay, here we go. Confucius and Lao Tzu. Oh, this is Chow Yun-fan, right?
Maybe. I'm not that familiar with Chinese actors.
孔丘啊，当今之事王纲失序，天下纷乱，可你还是要一意孤行，推行礼乐仁义吗？
丘惭愧，一无所成。
那就索性放弃吧。明觉者，公器也，不可久居。
那弟子何去何从？毕竟不能像葫芦一样挂在门楣上，无用于世。
无用，安知不是大用？弱则生，柔则存。天下莫弱于水，而攻坚者莫之能胜。上善若水啊！
先生微言大义，吾道一以贯之。先生的道是大象无形，超然物外，无限于世间。 而我的道，则在人间。
那就不要在意天下的误解了。富者赠人以金，我没有金子，就赠你这几句话吧。
Cool. Yeah, I can definitely see the difference in tone there. So one is more tied to the spirit and the other is more tied to the world of men, which is kind of what we're establishing here with Confucius.
Exactly. Confucius was trying to put in what Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching was teaching spiritually. So it was about setting up a system that kind of gets people to behave in a way in accordance to the Tao. And there's 5 different core concepts we're going to be talking about, but before we do that, just to get a sense of the importance of Confucius in Chinese history and also alleviate me of talking about Chinese history too much, there's the other video you clicked on before, which does that in about 8 minutes and gives a whole bunch of information about everything that happened. It's quite funny. I like that channel.
All right, so we've got 2,000 years of Chinese history in 10 minutes or less, roughly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about China, which these days is discussed almost constantly on television and in newspapers. Wait, are they still a thing? So we used to print information on thinly sliced trees, and then you would pay someone to take these thinly sliced trees and throw them onto your front lawn, and that's how we received information? No one thought this was weird, by the way. Right, but anyway, you hear a lot about how China's going to overtake the US and bury us under a pile of inexpensive electronics, but I don't want to address those fears today. Instead, I want to talk about how the way you tell a story shapes the story. China was really the first modern state, by which I mean it had a centralized government and a core of bureaucrats who could execute the wishes of that government, and it lasted in pretty much the same form from 150 BCE until 1911 CE, which is technically known as a long-ass time. The Chinese were also among the first people to write history. In fact, one of the Confucian classics is called the Shu Jing, or Classic of History. This is great for us because we can now see the things the Chinese recorded as they were happening, but it's also problematic because of the way the story is told. So even me from the past with this 5 minutes of world history knows that Chinese history is conveniently divided into periods called dynasties. Mr. Green, I didn't even say anything. That doesn't seem very fair. Shh! What makes a dynasty is that it's ruled by a king, or as the Chinese know him, an emperor, who comes from a continuous ruling family. As long as that family produces emperors, and they are always dudes.
No, they aren't. First off, there were several empress dowagers who wielded tremendous power throughout Chinese history, and there was one very important full-fledged empress, Empress Wu, who ruled China for more than 20 years and founded her own freaking dynasty.
And those emperors keep ruling, the dynasty gets to be a dynasty. So the dynasty can end for 2 reasons. Either they run out of dudes, which never happened thanks to the hard work of many, many concubines, or the emperor is overthrown after a rebellion or a war. This is more or less what happened to all the dynasties, which makes it easy for me to go over to camera 2 and describe them in a single run-on sentence. Hi there, camera 2. Leaving aside the Xia dynasty, which was sadly fictional, the first Chinese dynasty was the Shang, who were overthrown by the Zhao, which disintegrated into political chaos called the Warring States period, in which states warred over periods. Oh no, wait, it was a period in which states warred, which ended when the Qin emperor was able to extend his power over most of the heretofore warring states, but the Qin were replaced by the Han, which was the dynasty that really set the pattern for most of China's history and lasted for almost 400 years, after which China fell again into political chaos, which only means there was no dynasty that ruled over all of China. And out of this chaos rose the Sui, who were followed quickly by the Tang, who in turn were replaced after a short period of no dynasty by the Song, who saw a huge growth in China's commerce that was still not enough to prevent them from being conquered by the Yuan, who were both unpopular and unusual because they were Mongols, which sparked rebellions resulting in the rise of the Ming, which was the dynasty that built the Great Wall and made amazing vases, but didn't save them from falling to the Manchus, who founded a dynasty that was called the Qing, which was the last dynasty because in 1911 there was a rebellion like the ones in, say, America, France, or Russia, and the whole dynastic system, which at that point had lasted for a long-ass time, came to an end. And breathe. So that's what happened, but what's interesting as far as capital H history is concerned is why it happened, and especially why the people who were writing history at the time said it happened, which leads us to the Mandate of Heaven. So the concept of the Mandate of Heaven dates from the Zhou dynasty, and current historians think that they invented it to get rid of the Shang. Before the Zhou, China didn't even have a concept of heaven, or Tian, but they did have a high god called Shengdi. But the Zhou believed in Tian, and they were eager to portray the idea of heaven as eternal, so they ascribed the concept of the Mandate of Heaven back to a time even before the Shang. explaining that the Shang were able to conquer the Xia only because the Xia kings had lost the mandate of heaven. This, of course, would have been impossible, partly because the Xia kings had no concept of heaven, and partly because, as previously noted, they didn't exist, but let's just leave that aside. The Shujing is pretty specific about what caused the Xia kings to lose the mandate, by the way, explaining the attack on Xia may be traced to the orgies in Mingtao. Sadly, the Shujing is woefully short on details of these orgies, but orgies are the kind of behavior that is not expected of a ruler, and therefore heaven saw fit to come in, remove the mandate, and allow the Shang to take power. But then the Shang lost the mandate. Why? Well, the last Shang emperor is reported to have roasted and eaten his opponents, which, you know, bit of a deal breaker as far as the mandate of heaven is concerned. Of course, that might not actually have happened, but it would explain why heaven would allow the Zhou to come to power. So basically, the fact that one dynasty falls and is replaced by another in a cycle that lasts for 3,000 years is explained, in the eyes of early Chinese historians, by divine intervention based on whether the ruler behaves in a proper, upright manner. It's after-the-fact analysis that has the virtue of being completely impossible to disprove, as well as offering a tidy explanation for some very messy political history. And even more importantly, it reinforces a vision of moral behavior that is a cornerstone of Confucianism, which I will get to momentarily. But first, let's see an example of the mandate of heaven in action. So the Qin dynasty only lasted 38 years, but it's one of the most important dynasties in Chinese history. So important, in fact, that it gave the place its name, Qin. Can I just tell you guys that we literally just spent 20 minutes on that shot? We shot it like 40 times. Stan, you are in love with puns. The accomplishment of the Qin was to reunify China under a single emperor for the first time in 500 years, ending the Warring States period. As you can imagine, the making of that particular omelet required the cracking of quite a few eggs, and the great Qin Emperor Qin Shuangdi and his descendants developed a reputation for brutality that was justified. But it was also exaggerated for effect so that the successor dynasty, the Han, would look more legitimate in the eyes of heaven. So when recounting the fall of the Qin, historians focused on how a bunch of murderous eunuchs turned the Qin emperors into puppets, not literal puppets, although that would have been awesome. And these crazy eunuchs like tricked emperors into committing suicide when they started thinking for themselves, etc. So the mandate of heaven turned away from these suicidal puppet emperors, which set up a nice contrast with the early Han emperors, such as Wen, who came to power in 180 BCE and ruled benevolently, avoiding extravagance in personal behavior and ruling largely according to Confucian principles. Under Wen, there were no more harsh punishments for criticizing the government, executions declined, and most importantly for the Confucian scholars who were writing the history, the government stopped burning books. Thus, according to the ancient Chinese version of history, Emperor Wen, by behaving as a wise Confucian, maintains the mandate of heaven. So who is this Confucius I won't shut up about? Let's go to the thought bubble. Confucius was a minor official who lived during the Warring States period and developed a philosophical and political system he hoped would lead to a more stable state and society. He spent a great deal of his time trying to convince one of the powerful kings to embrace his system, but while none ever did, Confucius got the last laugh because his recipe for creating a functioning society was ultimately adopted and became the basis for Chinese government, education, and, well, most things. So Confucius was conservative. He argued that the key to bringing about a strong and peaceful state was to look to the past and the model of the sage emperors. By following their example of upright moral behavior, the Chinese emperor could bring order to China. Confucius's idea of morally upright behavior boils down to a person's knowing his or her place in a series of hierarchical relationships and acting accordingly. Everyone lives his life, or her life, but like most ancient philosophical traditions, women were marginalized, in relationship to other people, and is either a superior or an inferior. There are 5 key relationships, but the most important is the one between father and son, and one of the keys to understanding Confucius is filial piety, a son treating his father with reverential respect. The father is supposed to earn this respect by caring for the son and educating him, but this doesn't mean that a son has the right to disrespect a neglectful father. Ideally, though, both the father and the son will act accordingly. The son will respect the father, and the father will act respectably. Ultimately, the goal of both father and son is to be a superior man, chunzi in Chinese. If all men strive to be chunzi, the society as a whole will run smoothly. This idea applies especially to the emperor, who is like the father to the whole country. Oh, it's time for the open letter? All right. God, that's good. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, an iPhone? Stan, this doesn't factor into Chinese history until much later. An open letter to the Xia dynasty. Dear Xia Dynasty, why you gotta be so fictional? You contain all of the most awesome emperors, including my favorite emperor of all time, you the engineer. There are so many the greats and the terribles among royalty, and so few the engineers. We need more kings like you the engineer, Peter the mortgage broker, Danica the script supervisor, Stan the video editing and producer guy. Those should be our kings. I freaking love you, you the engineer, and the fact that you're not real, it breaks my heart in a way that could only be fixed by you the engineer. Circularity actually reminds me of the mandate of heaven. Best wishes, John Green. But back to the Chunzi. So how do you know how to behave? Well, first you have to look to historical antecedents, particularly the sage emperors. The study of history, as well as poetry and paintings, in order to understand and appreciate beauty, is indispensable for a Chunzi. The other important aspects of Chunziness are contained in the Confucian ideas of Ren and Li. Ren and Li are both incredibly complex concepts that are difficult to translate, but we're going to do our best. Ren is usually translated as propriety. It means understanding and practicing proper behavior in every possible situation, which of course depends on who you're interacting with, hence the importance of the 5 relationships. Li is usually translated as ritual and refers to rituals associated with Chinese religion, most of which involve the veneration of ancestors. Which brings us back in a very roundabout way to the fundamental problem of how early Chinese historians wrote their history. Traditional Chinese historians were all trained in the Confucian classics, which emphasized the idea that good emperors behaved like good Confucians. Would-be historians had to know these classics by heart, and they'd imbibed their lessons, chief among which was the idea that in order to maintain the mandate of heaven, you had to behave properly and not engage in orgies or eat your enemies while engaging in orgies. In this history, the political fortunes of a dynasty ultimately rest on one man and his actions, whether he behaves properly. The mandate of heaven is remarkably flexible as an explanation of historical causation. It explains why, as dynasties fell, there were often terrible storms and floods and peasant uprisings. If the emperor had been behaving properly, none of that stuff would have happened. Now, a more modern historian might point out that the negative effects of terrible storms and floods, which include peasant uprisings, sometimes lead to changes in leadership. But that would take the moral aspect out of history, and it would also diminish the importance of Confucian scholars, because the scholars can tell you that one of the best ways to learn how to be a good emperor and thereby maintain the mandate of heaven is to read the Confucian classics, which were written by scholars. In short, the complicated circularity of Chinese history is mirrored by the complicated circularity of the relationship between those who write it and those who make it. Which is something to think about no matter what history you're learning, even if it's from Crash Course. Next week we'll be talking about Alexander the Grape. Really, Stan, for an entire episode? That seems excessive to me. They're just like less sour, grapier lemon heads. Oh, Alexander the Great. That makes more sense. Until then, thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller.
Nice. 2,000 years of Chinese history in 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's a lot of to unpack in there. So we're going to dive into some of the core concepts of Confucianism. But I think it gives a good sense of how important Confucius and Confucian thought was for Chinese history, the way it's written, and the influence it had on all of Eastern societies, basically.
Sweet. It made me think a little bit of checks and balances in an indirect way, where it wasn't written into, say, a constitution, but as he was pointing out, where the classics are written by scholars and the rulers are expected to study these, it gives them a sort of power and influence that distributes the power across more people than just the emperor.
Yeah, an important thing to know there is basically Chinese history, there's been ups and downs. You had the sage emperors, which were really fictional, and then you had benevolent rulers and you had bad rulers. But one of the biggest issues in Chinese society was irrigation. It was an agricultural society, and a lot of water had to move a lot of places in order for people to be fed. So there were big projects that spanned over different regions, and a lot of people worked on these irrigation projects. And whenever some new ruler came to power or a war broke out, something would happen to those projects that would leave a lot of people starving. So that was the biggest problem that they were facing in that time, that irrigation projects would be stopped by any social uprise. And that's what led Confucius to come up with a system to basically guide the people in a way that society becomes more stable, and therefore more people would survive whenever something bad happens. So there's the core idea is just basically to have a stable society. Everyone is doing better when we're not doing war or eating our opponents, which came later on.
Zero-sum game versus positive-sum game.
Exactly. Yeah, so I'll be diving into. We start by talking about the Confucian ethics, and then we'll dive into the 5 core concepts, being learning and practice, the relationships, Yunzi, the gentleman scholar, tradition and ritual, and lastly, what this means for government. And all these concepts are really intertwined, so it's we'll see when we get into the quotes that it's 1 or 2 or 3 of them that come up at the same time, so they're all connected. But we start with learning and practice because that's how you yourself can improve as an ethical being. And secondly, relationships, basically the system surrounds you that kind of uplift you. And yeah, I want to give the plug to the translation I'll be using this time, the Edward Slingerland translation. And this time I have the okay from the author to use it.
I can paste that in the chat.
And it's a really beautiful translation, a bit less literal translation, but it has a lot of traditional commentary, which is important. When he talks about a state of 1,000 chariots, it kind of gives you a sense of what that means. And it's really a nice version to read if you never read Confucius texts.
One quick interjection here with your audio. You're cutting out a little bit on the bottom end. So if you go to your mic sensitivity, you might lower that threshold a little bit. I don't know if it's automatic. You'd probably disable that. So the cog wheel and then voice and video in Discord, and then down at input sensitivity.
Input sensitivity. And then I take it out?
Yeah, it should not be automatic.
Better now?
Well, it'll depend on your range. I have mine set to negative 77 decibels. So pretty far to the left.
Alright, I'm gonna try 69.
Cool. Yeah, because if it's too high, then as you trail off the end of a sentence or sometimes the start of one, you miss a little bit of that. So cool. As you were. 1,000 Chariots. Translation with consent by the author this time. Nice. Hello? He may have pushed a button or changed something. I don't hear him. Yeah, it was cutting off a little bit. Okay. Is he back?
Hello?
Hello.
I'm not sure what I did there.
Okay. Welcome
All right.
back.
Where were we? I was about to say something.
He recommended the translation, and there were the learning and practice I think we were talking about.
Yeah. Now we start with basically the four classics, or now the five classics in Chinese history, and these are the books that Confucius, he didn't write them himself, but he was most likely the one who added them to the version that we know nowadays. And these really informed his views on how a state should be run or how a person should behave. And they already were covered in the video. So there's the classic of poetry, there's the book of documents, which is basically a list of different court documents from the period before the Warring State, basically the Sue period. Then there's the Book of Rites, which gives all those rules for how to do ceremonies. Then there's the I Ching, which is a really interesting read. I think we're not going to go into that one because it's pretty weird at times. But it's basically the metaphysics of Confucian thought. And then there's the Spring and Autumn Annals, which is another history recording of Confucius' native state. And there used to be a sixth classic, which is the classic of music, which was lost during the burning of books that came after the Warring States period. And with the five classics, there's the four books, two of them being parts of the Book of Rites. There's the Great Learning, basically about how to teach people how the systems should be set up, that people learn the right things the right way. And there's the Doctrine of Mean, which is focused on the good person and how to live in a proper manner by the Tao. Then there's the Analects, which we'll be reading from today, and the fourth book is on Mencius, and it's basically Mencius's dialogues about Confucius' thought, and Mencius lived about 2 generations after Confucius. He's said to be contemporary with Confucius's grandson. We're not 100% sure about that, though. But yeah, these are the five, or the 7 books that make up all of the teachings between 200 BCE up until 1900 China. Like, all the scholars read these, they knew them by heart, and these informed them on how to make decisions, how to be good, how to write history, as we learned. Yeah, so these are the texts that inform Chinese thought. Yeah, one other thing I wanted to say, basically the time that Confucius lived during the Warring States period was the time that is known as the 100 Schools of Thought, and that's the map I included.
Is that it?
Yeah, exactly. So basically during that time, which spans a bit longer than just the Warring States period, there were a lot of different schools popping up, a lot of different ideas, and they competed with each other to some degree, but they also went along pretty well. And I think this is something we should cover on another episode, just to go a bit through all those different schools of thought. There's some pretty interesting stuff in there. I think, but I'm not sure, Sun Tzu, The Art of War, should be in there, or during that time period as well. I'm not sure if it's considered to be one of the 100 schools of thought.
And so it seems like an explosion in the propagation and marketplace of ideas.
Exactly. And there was, I don't remember the name of the scholar that did this work, but he described basically this period of time between 1000 BCE and around 200 BCE as the, what was the term? The Axial Age. And it's basically this free marketplace of ideas that everyone seemed to contribute, and just so many things popping up, which is partly due to our oldest writings are from around that time. So it's probably there was a marketplace of ideas before that, but we didn't know about it because they had no written history, or not to the same degree. Yeah, so on the person of Confucius. Confucius lived, I have to look this up, I'm terrible with dates. 550 till 480 BC. And as I said, he lived in the state of Lu during the Warring States period. He was a noted scholar already at a pretty young age. And he was serving the Duke of Lu at the time. And he went on to serve other dukes because he fell off with the Duke and him not respecting the mandate of heaven, which is a pretty fun story. Basically, the emperor had 8 rows of dancers at some of his festivals, which was against the Book of Rights, basically saying that depending on your level of, on your social level, basically, you can have different amounts of dancers at any of your festivities that you do. And 8 rows of dancers would be reserved for the emperor. So someone that would have 8 rows of dancers just as a duke, this was unfathomable for Confucius. But he didn't leave at that point because he felt like the duke would fall off grace by the people if Confucius were just about to leave suddenly. So he waited until the duke made a smaller transgression and took that as a reason to leave. Which is a Yunzi way to handle things, to say the least. Yeah. I think that's about as much we need to know about Confucius to start really get into the thick of things. So there's 5 Confucian ethics. There's a picture for that too.
The virtues?
Yeah, exactly.
Got it.
So we start off with Ren, which is benevolence or humaneness, which is basically you treating people in a good sense. Second one is Yi, righteousness or justice. Is it the same? Yeah. Third one is Li, is proper right, which is basically doing things in accordance to how the Book of Rights sets out the way you should do things, and we'll get into why that is and why you being able of doing a right tea ceremony reflects your character, basically. Then there's knowledge, C, and integrity, Xing. And these are the core principles all of Confucian thought are built upon. So we're going to start with knowledge, because knowledge informs you about all the other things, because it's difficult to do the proper rites, to be righteous or just, or to be benevolent or humane, if you don't know how to do that or what it implies to be that way. Yeah. So I'm not sure how we want to do this. Basically, I have all the sayings in the script. Should I just read them, or you want to add them to the screen as well?
So the sayings, I could just put them up, kind of like I do the video. If we
Yeah.
do that. Okay, so this is the learning, teaching, and practice section.
Exactly.
Okay. Nice. Learning, teaching,
So-
and practice 1.1. Do you want me to just read one?
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
The master said, "To learn and then have occasion to practice what you have learned. Is this not satisfying? To have friends from afar, is this not a joy? To be patient, even when others do not understand, is this not the mark of the gentleman?"
So we're already getting into a couple of concepts here. Basically, to learn and have occasion to practice. And this is really important in Confucius thought, that just learning is not worth a lot if you don't practice what you've learned. Basically, knowing how to be a good person leads nowhere if you don't practice good behavior in everyday life.
Yeah, this speaks to how I feel about coaching and the expectation of students, where a coaching session is mainly a way that I'm trying to point someone in the right direction, but I don't cause them to be promoted or to move up. That's entirely earned by their practice. So if they get to the next league, and sometimes they'll say it was because of you, I would disagree with that, because I just gave them a framework that they can use to figure things out and move on their own. But yeah, that process of learning and then practicing is very rewarding. And from a memory capacity, you're more likely to internalize information that you learn if you apply it in a variety of ways.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really important to basically understand something is good, but as long as you don't put it into practice, it gets you nowhere. It's basically what you do with the 30 overlord, where you constantly remind yourself of it and then really try to get it in on time, which can be difficult.
I know it.
Yeah, so 1.4. Every day I examine myself on 3 counts. In my dealing with others, have I in any way failed to be dutiful? In my interactions with friends and associates, have I in any way failed to be trustworthy? Finally, have I in any way failed to put into practice what I teach? So we already see some of the hierarchy and the different relationships. So you have to treat others with duty, but your friends and associates you have to treat trustworthy. And finally, again, you need to put into practice what you learn or also what you teach.
Yep, it's the application. It can be, well, it's definitely a challenge because it's a lot easier to articulate a good piece of advice than it is to act it out whenever you're in those situations, because you don't really experience life in a vacuum. There are a bunch of different temptations and weaknesses and vulnerabilities that end up manifesting when you're in that situation. So being able to concentrate your focus and decide to do the right thing, even when you have urges to do the wrong thing, is pretty tough.
Yeah. And I like what Angelic Nutcake says, that teaching somebody else is interesting because it helps you yourself to learn. And this is the experience I had whenever I prepare for these lectures, that I have to look at the things a lot more in depth than I would when normally reading them. And it helps me to understand the concepts a lot more than I would if I just read through the books.
It's also being able to put it into your own words as well, which is the process of linking a new piece of information to your existing knowledge. It's really easy to just echo a given statement. Like you heard someone say something and you can repeat it after them, but to weave it into your existing knowledge involves more of a active experience. It's active learning rather than the passive learning, where people just give you a bunch of different responses and quips and stuff like that. It tends to happen a lot, especially with politics, where instead of teaching people to think critically and assess how to find common ground and compromise, they say, okay, you get in this situation against this type of person, this is your response. And people end up getting what's effectively an ammo pouch to just throw banter back and forth at each other, but they're missing the whole point of like the basis of society and what you're supposed to be working toward and how you can think about that for yourself.
Yeah, I think that basically comes back to what we talked about before, where we just tend to like easy solutions. So it's a lot easier to remember how to respond to something rather than having it interweaved into your own thinking and giving a personal response rather than a repeated one.
So 1.14, the gentleman is not motivated by the desire for a full belly or a comfortable abode. He is simply scrupulous in behavior and careful speech, drawing near those who possess the way in order to be set straight by them. Surely this and nothing else is what it means to love learning.
Yeah, so this is already, or again, goes into the notion of relationships and basically choosing who you spend time with, and the people that possess the way will set you straight just by them being virtuous, and you can learn from them. And if you love knowledge, you love people that can provide you with such knowledge.
Yeah, I've talked with some people about how developing your own speechcraft involves having conversations with people who are better at it than you are, and finding different friends who enrich your life rather than just kind of exist alongside you. It is good to have companions and that sort of thing, but to have a friend and companion who, as you're discussing things with them, you learn alongside them, it makes it very rewarding. And if you move to some other area of your life, that knowledge of them and the stuff they shared with you is with you forever.
Yeah, there's so much beauty in a good conversation, and having someone, I can't remember who said this, but basically the quote is that he doesn't want a friend to mirror his every move and follow him everywhere. He's got a shadow that does that way better than any friend could do. So basically, that a friend should be someone that helps you but also challenges you, that can be someone to have good conversations with, but isn't just listening to you, but also sets you straight when you say something stupid.
Yeah, that's pretty difficult to do as a friend, I think, because it's easier to just be someone's hype man and just tell them, yeah, you're right, you got this, you can do it, and you just take their side in everything, which one of the most important things you can do for someone is hold them accountable and try to hold them back if they're going to go for something that is really unwise for them, or if they're wrong, because then they're going to end up suffering for that later on if you knew that they were on the wrong path but said nothing. And sometimes you're afraid that you're going to hurt their feelings or that it's going to put the friendship in jeopardy. So a really robust and dynamic friendship should be one where you're able to critique the other and give some feedback, even if it doesn't necessarily feel good to hear.
Yeah, this is basically trustworthiness, as he described with the friends and associates, where you don't necessarily think that your friend wants to hear this, but it's something you think they need to hear, so you better put it out there than just basically that if they fall off from the way, it also reflects on you, so it's in your interest and it's in their interest to be set straight by them. But it's a difficult thing to do. I struggle with this as well, where I think, well, you should do something differently, but then I go, well, you're doing it okay. So this is a really tough thing to do. And being a good friend is not an easy task. But it's also something that we can learn over time and just try to do our best every time we are in a conversation and we get the knowledge on how we should do things and then try to put it into practice, as Confucius would have put it. Oh yeah, I forgot one quote and I didn't include this in the written form, but I want to read it anyways now before I go on to the next one, which is also a autobiography by Confucius in some sense. And Confucius was really self-critical and some degree at least, and others not so much, and we'll see that later on. So this is 2.4. The master said, at 15, I set my mind upon learning. At 30, I took my place in society. At 40, I became free of doubts. At 50, I understood heaven's mandate. At 60, my ears were attuned. And at 70, I could follow my heart's desire without overstepping the bounds of propriety. This is as much as we know about about Confucius' sense of his own history. So basically, at 15, he set his mind up on learning. At 30, he took his place. 40, free of doubts. 50, he understood the mandate of heaven, basically knowing what heaven wants. But it still took him another 10 years to get attuned to that, and another 10 years from the atonement to doing whatever he wanted without ever overstepping the boundaries of mandate's heaven. So yeah, it's a lifetime of trying to improve, and that's what Confucius did and what he taught.
This quote in particular reminds me of a course that I took in psychology of lifespan and development, where it kind of breaks down the human lifespan by decade and talks about a lot of the major themes of development for each one. And this is his personal progression as he lists it, and it's very simplified, but you can think of similar themes and how different people tend to develop and behave throughout the course of their life.
Yeah. And then the next one goes into the same idea, and it's 717. If I were granted many more years and could devote 50 of them to learning, surely I would be able to be free of major faults. So I'm not quite sure how old he was at the time when he wrote this, but he said, well, if I have 50 more years to learn, I'd surely get to the point where I wouldn't do any major faults anymore. Which is pretty humble to know that it's just so difficult to be human and to try to live a good life that you will always fail to one degree or another. But just devote yourself to learning and you'll get better over time.
I think this one's pretty easy to take literally, but I think he's maybe saying 50 in like a figurative capacity of 50 years is a long time. And if he could devote an extremely large amount of time, then he would be better. And by saying then he would be free of major faults, he's saying that he does have major faults still. So in the figurative capacity, it's a very humble quote. In the literal capacity, it's kind of a weird prediction of how long it would take to free yourself of faults, which I don't think he's doing that here.
Yeah, I'd also say it's figuratively.
Yeah.
And I like how he said if I were granted many more years, that he would devote 50 of them. He would not spend all his time just learning. There's other things to do if you get granted a lot more years, which is kind of nice too. There's other things than learning that are worthwhile, which is also in here but kind of gets lost.
Mm. In the next one, both keeping past teachings alive and understanding the present. Someone able to do this is worthy of being a teacher. This reminds me of the aspect of deciding to stream as Neuro and bring Sun Tzu and Miyamoto Musashi and Bruce Lee to an esports audience. It seemed like really unfortunate and short-sighted that there are a lot of concepts that are addressed in Sun Tzu Art of War that apply directly to RTS play that people aren't aware of. And it's really unfortunate because the stuff was figured out thousands of years ago and we're still making the same mistake and then raging about it. So yeah, being aware of the scope of literature that's already out there that you can use and how that applies to the present and how you can innovate new teachings based on all of that.
Yeah, Sun Tzu is a pretty interesting work, although I was a bit disappointed by it because I do not aspire to become a warlord and send my armies around, so I thought there was little knowledge for me in there that would be beneficial. So I would not necessarily recommend reading Sun Tzu unless you have those ambitions.
Well, for me, some of them apply to the format of video games that we play. So not necessarily becoming the warlord, but seeing how war works. And if you're playing a war video game, then the principles fit one-to-one. The main problems you have there are stuff like air units and teleportation, which didn't exist in his time. Sun Tzu, what would you do about warp gate all-ins? He just rolled over in his grave hearing about that.
I think one of his teaching was to have a small army. If you have a smaller army, then you need good position, and if you have a bigger army, you need to be wary of the position. Or rather, if you have a small army, that you need to divert the big army to split it up into different things. Not sure how that applies to Warp Gate All-Ins, though. Yeah, so basically, this goes back to the notion of what it means to learn things. Basically, you learn from the past to understand the present, and if you're able to understand what you learned and apply it to the present, you're a worthy teacher. Which I'm not sure if all of my teachers had a good sense of either the past or the present. They had a good sense of the subject matter they were talking about, but not in a sense that they could apply it to the format of how it has been and how it should be.
Yeah, it lacked some of the scale of knowledge that's going on and has been. So the next, remark well what I'm about to teach you. This is wisdom, to recognize what know as what you know, and recognize what you do not know as what you do not know. So this is understanding the boundary of your own ignorance and how that's an active process and realizing ignorance over time. And as you age or as you specialize in a given field, you should increase in your knowledge, but also increase in the awareness of your ignorance at the same time.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I included this. I think not. Basically, he says about Yunzi, about the gentleman, that the gentleman is broad and not narrow, so that they should not strive to specialize, but keep a broad knowledge about everything. Because specialization.
Some of this is echoed in Miyamoto Musashi. He says, touch upon all of the arts, which is a similar aspect. Rather than be the best artist you can be in one thing, being aware of all of them in some capacity.
Yeah.
He was recommending.
Specialization back then there weren't as many different possibilities of specialization as there are nowadays. So everything was agricultural, and I think they had less art, less poets, less things to read and to look at. So trying not to specialize nowadays is really difficult to really keep a broad overview over what's happening. I think as the opportunities grow, it gets really hard to have an overview of everything. But trying not to just stick to one thing and shut your mind off to other things is important. And then 7.8. It's the one I already talked about. I will not open the door for a mind that is not already striving to understand, nor will I provide words to a tongue that is not already struggling to speak. If I hold up one corner of a problem and the student cannot come back to me with the other three, I will not attempt to instruct him again.
Yeah, I've noticed this theme. Some people like the experience of being in a student-teacher relationship, but they don't have the internal motivation to create their own path of learning for themselves. And this is part of the assessment process I do when I'm deciding who I want to coach, because you can kind of tell some people, they want your time, but it doesn't seem like they're really hungry for their own process of improvement. And it ends up being a lot less productive. I think for both parties, it ends up being part of the social game rather than a really long-term investment. Because the best coaching sessions are when you have a coach and they give you a better sense of the landscape so that the person can navigate it better for themselves and build their own maps from it, rather than to just teach them one technique or something that they can polish, and it ends up making them kind of like a trained robot rather than an active mind.
Yeah, I think this is a misconception people have with coaching or what it's supposed to do. And again, goes back to the notion of having an easy solution. So someone that wants that easy solution should get a teacher, being probably one of your YouTube videos on how to do a build, rather than having you as a coach.
Yup.
Yeah, so these are some of the Confucius's view on learning, teaching, and the emphasis on practice, that you should always try to put into practice what you do. And how do we learn things? Where do we learn things from first? And this goes into the big topic of relationships, which basically everything he talks about is in terms of relationships. You learn from it in terms of the relationships you had. There's this picture of the 5 different relationships that is in the folder.
Let's get it. 5 really. Oh, got him.
So back in ancient China, there was little talk about women. They were a subclass, similar to how it was in Greece at the time. So all these are male terms, but it applies to females just as well. But Confucius was a conservative, so it would be really out of character if he would have talked about wives and daughters and younger sister and older sister, for example. So the 5 relationships we have: ruler-subject, father-son, husband-wife, elder brother, younger brother, and friend to friend. And basically, it's wrong here that ruler-subject comes before father-son. Father-son is the most important relationship you'll have because it's the first relationship you have, and it informs you about all the other relationships you'll have later on in life. And there's a really nice example on how this applies in the text. So the notion of filial piety and how you should act as a son towards your father, but also how you should act as a father towards your son, setting you up for the rest of your life. So this is really important, and there's a lot of text on how to behave on both sides. Then there's the husband-wife relationship, which I would prefer to be in the same way as friend-friend, where it's not a hierarchical relationship, but something that both get something out of it, as it is with the friend-friend relationship. And basically the relationship you have with your siblings, which also inform you on how to treat others through the rest of your lifetime. Yeah, so those are the 5 pillars of relationship that inform all of your being. And I don't think this was new knowledge at the time. This wasn't something mind-breaking for the people, but it's the first time we had it. We got it this clear, and just basically, well, if you didn't have a good relationship with your father, it's no wonder you don't have a good relationship with your ruler, for example, or that you struggle having good relationships with your friends. One other interesting thing to note here: there's 2 things you can pick in here. You can pick your friends, and you can hopefully pick your wife. I'm not 100% sure how that was in ancient China, but I think there's at least some degree of choice you had. While all the other relationships you're just born into. You can choose your father, you can choose your siblings, and you could definitely not choose your ruler back in that time.
You could say your ruler lost the mandate of heaven.
Yeah, you can definitely do that. Yeah, so 1.8. If a gentleman is not serious, he will not inspire awe, and what he learns will be grasped only superficially. Let your actions be governed by dutifulness and trustworthiness, and do not accept as a friend one who is not your equal. If you have committed a transgression, do not be afraid to change your ways.
So the first part to me speaks of the importance of charisma and how the delivery of what you're saying goes a long way and how it affects other people. And charisma is a morally neutral quality, but if you're in the marketplace of ideas and trying to push your good ideas and virtue and things like that, it's an important edge. You don't want people who are working against your ideals to have more charisma and thus more social pull in that marketplace. And then the next part, not accepting a friend who's not your equal, is kind of interesting. Basically, it's, I think, being aware of friendships that are going to be a net improvement on your life rather than people who are going to be a burden and holding you back or weighing you down. I think it's harder to see this at the beginning of a friendship, but over time, if you have a really major imbalance where one friend is asking a lot more of you than you're asking of them, it can end up being pretty destructive for you, and you need to be able to decide when a friendship is no longer a good idea.
Yeah, totally. This is one of my favorite quotes from Confucius, to be wise in how to choose your friends. And I had a lot of discussions about this, what it means to have someone be your equal. And I'm pretty sure that Confucius meant this in a moral sense, not in a sense of how much money they make or whether or not they're as good StarCraft players as you are. So basically, that equal being someone that has the same moral uprightness as you have. So you don't want someone that would weigh you down in a moral sense. This is basically why people have a problem that their kids hanging out with kids of other parents, because they feel it's a bad influence.
Yeah, so the weight here you're talking about isn't just obligations and duties and actions, it's also morality, ethics, uprightness, righteousness, those kinds of things where you tend to be like your friends. So spending time with people who are going to be corrupting a lot of your values is going to be not good for you.
Yeah. And on that note, I want to acknowledge you and the way I came back to your stream, because you show a moral uprightness with your streaming that is I haven't seen before in the StarCraft scene, and that made me gravitate back to your stream. And yeah, you set a really nice example there on how to behave when even though you lost. So that's
It kind of
for me, that's
surprised
really
me.
beautiful.
It kind of surprised me the lack of awareness for a lot of broadcasters for if you have an audience with hundreds of people or thousands of people or tens of thousands for the big streamers, how major of an impact that is. So being really careful about the example that you're setting, because it sends ripples to all other smaller forms of communities. You'll see stuff sometimes copy pasted from what Idra and what other streamers say in various chats in the StarCraft client. So it's a really big deal. And I think it ends up being a big point of pressure, but it's worth it to hold yourself accountable and try to set a really good example. Even if you're not having the best day, just being really uncompromising with your principles. I definitely have those days where I'm like internally screaming. I'm like losing over and over again. I'm facing opponents that are really tough and I don't really feel the best. I think the past 2 days were a good example of that. But yep, the example that you said is more important than the MMR that you gain or lose in the session.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think it's, as we said before, basically it's not always easy to be good, and you'll fail occasionally, and just always trying to get back up and try again, and just constantly try to improve over the course of your lifetime. That's the important thing. And I think there is also something to said about the moral character of your friends, whether or not they're people that are willing to go through this process and are willing to fail and to stand back up and to try again, or if they just stop trying altogether.
Yeah, a friendship, like a really involved and good friendship, changes a person. Two people who share experiences tend to be more like each other at the end of it. And that's a really beautiful aspect of friendship, and one that you should expect, I think. If you're in a friendship relationship with someone, it's not a test of seeing how consistently you can be the same as you've always been. It's seeing opportunities to do things in a different way with new knowledge that you have, that sometimes might be a little bit uncomfortable starting out, but can be pretty refreshing and helpful over the long term. Pact, the person I was dating for the past 3.5 years or so, she made a really big impression on me, especially my awareness of a lot of different social issues that hadn't really been put in front of me. Relatively speaking, I'm a pretty isolated person after university. I was like off in Canada doing poker and studying how to become neuro and stuff like that, but I wasn't really involved in communities and a lot of the modern struggles of society, whereas she was a lot more focused on social issues and a active mindful awareness of that, I think, helps a lot with creating a welcoming and positive Twitch stream where you're aware of the different difficulties that people from demographics outside your own are beset by. So yeah, I'm a different person now than I was before we dated, and that's a good thing. You do want to be aware too of the negative aspects that can try to rub off on you as well, because you want to have that friendship, and then ideally you both end up on the end of that better people than you were before you started, rather than worse.
No, that's a really nice way of putting it, that you want to be aware that it could go wrong, but you choose wisely enough to have someone that, so both of you benefit. What you said at the beginning reminded me of quite a few conversations I had with people about getting into a relationship, and a lot of people seem to think that they want to get, on the one side they want to get into a relationship, on the other hand they want to stay themselves, which is pretty impossible, I'd say. Where if you just get together with someone but are not willing to change with them or change for them, which doesn't mean you have to go 180 and do everything differently, but you kind of have to be willing to grow together. Like it's not a relationship.
Yeah.
So people tend to overrate how important they are basically when they get into a relationship, and they don't want to change for any reason. And I think this is the wrong way to approach it.
Yeah, a lot of people think of the relationship in terms of fulfilling their desires, like their physical desires, their emotional desires, and their social desires, rather than seeing that person as a dynamic, evolving entity that you can also have as a really good friend. And I think you should. A good relationship, your partner should also be your friend, not just someone who's that sort of accessory. It feels like a sort of item slot. If you're looking at a character in an RPG, if you got your helm, your shoulders, your main weapon, your offhand, and then your like companion, someone who just kind of follows you around, and if you need them, then you call on them and stuff. But a really good relationship is challenging, and you have to have a lot of active attention about who the other person is, what they want, and also how you can be a really supportive friend to them.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. If your partner is not your friend, you're doing something wrong. You want to read the next one?
Sure.
13.18.
Yep. The Duke said, "Among my people there is one we call upright going. When his father stole a sheep, he reported him to the authorities. Confucius replied, 'Among my people, those who we consider upright are different from this. Fathers cover up for their sons, and sons cover up for their fathers. Uprightness is to be found in this.'" There's a statement on this in the Bible about covering for your brother, which is an interesting commentary on justice, because in the technical capacity, there was theft and a rule has been broken. But if you're prioritizing family above the law, which he's basically doing with this segment, then you would cover for people who are close to you. And this ties into the relationships that we mentioned before. So if you have a direct tie to someone else, then you're prioritizing them over the law of the land.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I took issue with the ruler-subject relationship being first in the kind of hierarchy on the picture. So it's father son is most important. But basically, you're always closer to your family than you are to your ruler, and it's the way it should be, basically. Otherwise, you're doing something wrong.
The next one is pretty funny.
Oh, yeah, that's basically filial piety in action. So 2.6, give your parents no cause for anxiety other than the possibility that they might fall ill. So you should always act in a manner that they don't have to fear about you, about your well-being. They shouldn't fear about you making bad decisions or doing other stupid things. The only cause for anxiety they should have is they themselves might fall ill, which is another principle that is really difficult to follow, but it's something to strive towards. And it took me, let's say, I started getting a sense of this when I was around 25 years old. So I think I caused a lot of anxiety up until that point. And I still do, to some degree.
Yeah, as a kid, I was pretty compliant. I didn't really do too much stuff that was that out of line. I went to a couple parties in high school, but one of the things that my parents encouraged myself and my brother to do was host the parties at our house, and that gave them more control over the rules and made sure that no one was out driving or taking any physical risks and whatnot. So that's a interesting aspect that also is partially on the burden of the parents to communicate effectively with the children and articulate what causes them anxiety and how they can compromise in a way that the child has some freedom to develop and experience and stuff, but also that the parent would tolerate that level of freedom. And it's going to depend on the nature of the kids and the demeanor of the parents and all that kind of stuff. There is some discussion on the previous point too, which, to clarify, we're talking about Confucius's opinion, not our opinion, myself or Eche Fatum. So he's prioritizing the family over the law of the land, and that doesn't mean that we're saying, oh yeah, that's correct. It depends on a lot of different factors. So murder was brought up. If there is a murder that happens, you know about your family murdering someone, do you call the police? That's an interesting thing that you can develop, I guess, in the general ethical capacity of when does it cross a line? Because for a lot of minor offenses, like your dad is speeding on the highway or something, you're not going to call the police or try to get him in trouble for something like that if he's going 10 miles per hour over or what have you. But there's that area where it becomes kind of gray of you feel really bad about it and you're unsure of what you should do. And then there's a super obvious side, like someone kills somebody else. I mean, you're going to go with the law on that one.
I wouldn't even necessarily agree there. I think if there's good reason, I think there's also good reason to cover up for it. Not necessarily saying that's the right thing to do, but I could imagine myself covering up for a friend or family member killing someone if I believe they did it for the right reasons.
Yeah, part of that depends on the law of the land and what structures they have in place. Because I think a lot of them, I don't know much about Swiss law. You're in Switzerland, right?
Yeah.
I don't know too much about that, but I do know that in the United States and especially Texas, the freedoms for self-defense are very broad. So there are a lot of situations where you're put into physical danger and you have a lot of freedom to retaliate against that within the bounds of the law. So someone is on your property, they're stealing your stuff or threatening you. Texas is like super liberal if you can shoot them under all these different circumstances. So it's kind of on the extreme end by global standards, but yeah, it does depend a lot on how strict the laws are and also how effective the justice system is. And you see this in a lot of different communities. Depending on how effective the police and the courts are, you'll have more or less gang action, because if the police and the courts are not serving the people justice in a way that they feel satisfied, then a lot of times they'll take that into their own hands and form their own groups that deal out reprisals and things like that. So there are a lot of different elements to this, depending on the situation, the relationship of the people in the situation, what the offense was, and how effective the different justice systems in place are, and who's dealing out the justice.
Yeah, I think there's no way you could get away with killing someone even though they broke into your house in Switzerland. I think there's a lot of leeway in how your sentence would be reduced, but you'll always get some sort of sentencing for it. But I'm not my area of expertise.
$4.20. One who makes no charges to the ways of his father for 3 years after his father has passed away may be called a filial son. Did I say charges or changes?
You said charges.
Oops, I meant changes. Whoops. One who makes no changes to the ways of his father. Is that saying that's good? That you shouldn't make changes?
So basically the 3-year period is the usual mourning period you had when one of your parents died. Mm-hmm. And I think it says that basically if you don't make changes to, this was talking in a agricultural sense. So if your father died, you took over the farm and you didn't change anything. You did all things the same that your father taught you. So it both says something about your father being a good parent, as well as it tells something about you being a good son. So if your father was a good father, and you don't see any need for change after he's gone.
Yeah, it's tying into that theme of stability and tradition being really valuable. In the West, especially American society, it's a lot more encouraging to make major changes from your parents' generation. If your parents were not setting a good example or doing a good thing, then moving far from home and being a very different person would be seen as a sign of virtue. Whereas this is trying to have a father-son relationship where the father is good and sets good traditions, so good that the son copies those directly, and then you have a lot of stability and predictability in that family system from the perspective of the ruler. They can predict what's happening in this farm. They're going to have consistent output, stuff like that. So they're praising this sort of thing, as opposed to the more shorter-term, risk-seeking, entrepreneurial attitude of a lot of Western thought.
Yeah, this has a lot to do with the possibilities that we have nowadays. Those were not the case back in Confucius' time. So you could not just go to another town and set up your new farm. So you had to deal with what was there, and doing it in the same manner as your father did just informs that you respect tradition, and also that you were brought up in a good manner and you were a filial son. But yeah, this risk-seeking behavior in the Western world has something to do with that we don't have the same notions of tradition, of family values as it is taught in the Confucian canon. And you see a big difference there between Western and Eastern societies, which is pretty interesting when you go to any Asian countries to observe them and how they behave differently than we do in Western societies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's basically the different relationships and how to honor them and how to conduct them is a big part of all of the Analects, or basically all of the Confucian writings, being the other 4 edits or 5 edits that he did. So they always come back to these different notions of how important is what relationship and how they interact with each other and how one builds upon each other. And basically, someone wanting to have good relationships is a way to ethically improve themselves, to become the Yunzi, the scholarly gentleman. And in the video we watched in the beginning, it was called Superior Man, which is an interesting notion we'll get into when we talk about Nietzsche and the will be a couple of centuries we have to cover first. But basically, Nietzsche talked about the superhuman, which is a pretty similar concept of how a person should behave and should stand above morality, basically. And I never heard of Yunzi described as the superior man before, so I read some really interesting articles on how this notion of Confucius informed Nietzsche's thinking, which was pretty interesting, but would be a bit too complicated to get into right now. But we'll definitely will when we cover Nietzsche.
Cool.
Yeah, so Yunzi, the scholarly gentleman, the person that has spent 50 years learning to get to the point where they can act without doing major missteps. 1.4. The master said, a clever tongue and a fine appearance are rarely signs of goodness. So this is about Confucius living at the time that he did. He was really skeptical about the ruling class at the time. So he looked back at the sage emperors that were before, and he saw all the failings of the rulers at the time. And just because someone had a clever tongue and were wearing nice clothes doesn't mean that he is a good person. So this is kind of a sting at nobility at the time.
We do have a human bias to tend to trust people who are more attractive and better presenting, and this almost seems like a counter strategy to that. So if we have that biological shortcut that we take, that can betray us oftentimes when, say, a con artist is very well dressed and very well spoken and they trick you out of a whole bunch of money. So, an interesting piece here. They likely didn't know about that bias back at this point, but they certainly could tell whenever a good-looking person tricks them out of something.
I think that they already knew about the bias, but they didn't have the means to statistically prove it. Also interesting there is that we have a bias towards people that give that react quickly to a question. So it doesn't really matter if your answer is correct, as long as you give it quickly and do it confidently. People are more likely to trust you, which is pretty counterproductive as well.
Yeah, it's usually seen as a sign of strength for someone to fire back quickly. But it's not a sign of wisdom.
Yeah, wisdom is different from knowledge. I think we've established that by now.
Nerd Rage says, I'm pretty sure they knew back in the day that people would do stupid things for pretty people. Yeah, probably. The thing
Most
is,
likely.
the aspect of associating goodness with good looks is kind of natural, I think. And that's the bias that wasn't quite as obvious. So 213, the gentleman first expresses his views and then acts in accordance with them. That seems like an awareness of one's own moral compass and how you should have a basic set of principles that you could explain rather than just kind of following all your urges that you have.
Yeah, exactly. That nerd rage comment reminded me of something one of my friends said. He basically said, imagine how many of the greatest speeches ever given in human history, say someone like Martin Luther King. I don't know, there's probably a lot more that could come to mind. But basically, imagine how many of those great speeches were not done because they wanted to give a great speech, but simply to impress one woman in the audience or one woman. There's a quite funny view where it's you don't really know why people give those speeches, and giving them to one person to impress someone seems more likely than just writing this beautiful speech that will go down in human history.
Yeah, maybe. That seems like kind of a cynical interpretation.
It definitely is a cynical interpretation, but I thought it was a nice thing to say on the notion of people doing stupid stuff. You can also do nice stuff for the wrong reasons. Mm-hmm. What I was trying to point out.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so basically this one is a repetition of what we had before, that you know how to be good, you can express how to be good, but most importantly, you have in accordance with what you know to be good. And 4.1, to live in the neighborhood of the good is fine. If one does not choose to dwell among those who are good, how will one obtain wisdom? So this is, again, the same notion of choosing the people you surround yourself with. If those people are not good, how could you learn how to become good if you don't surround yourself with good people?
Mm-hmm. There was a point raised by Angelica in the chat about how sometimes it's worth engaging with people who maybe aren't quite as morally upright as yourself for the purpose of challenging them to do better and improving them. So you're never going to be in a situation where everyone is perfectly good and they just radiate positivity and everything is fantastic. Everyone is flawed. And oftentimes people complement each other in different ways. Say you excel in this area, but you're weak in another, and someone else offsets that in a positive way. It reminds me of a quote. If you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. So in that capacity, you could echo a similar capacity. If you're the most upright person in the room, you're in the wrong room. These things aren't like general perfect wisdom, but there's something to gather from it, I think.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy to recall situations where you can tell when someone is trying to assert themselves as the smartest person in the room, that it's almost a competition. So like, hey, what's your IQ? What's your IQ? What degrees do you have? What degrees do you have? Can I beat you in this argument? Can I beat you in this debate? It creates a aggressive attitude that I think misses a lot of the knowledge you could gain from other people.
Yeah, if it becomes about being right or being better than the other person, you tend to always think about what to say next rather than listening to the other person. So there's little to be learned from that. You can just reinforce your own beliefs by repeating them for yourself in order to make a good point as soon as the other person stops for a short brief. And yeah, basically that there's things to be learned from people that aren't as upright as you are will be something that comes up about 2 quotes down. 4.17 would that be? When you see someone who is worthy, concentrate upon becoming their equal. When you see someone unworthy, use this as an opportunity to look within yourself. So if you see someone better than you, try to become as good as they are. And if you see someone that is not as good as you, reflect within yourself on how you could become better. So it's not about confronting someone that is unworthy, but it is about self-reflection and using this opportunity as well as the other one to become better yourself.
Now, a lot of people make a hobby of talking smack about other people and puffing themselves up as a result. A lot of gossip tends to work this way, I think, where you point out the wrongdoings of other people and it ends up being a sort of spicy conversation rather than one that is productive for any party involved.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can lead in a sort of productive direction, but I think a lot of times it's kind of what you would find in the tabloid journalism of, look at the scandal, look at what happened, look at how bad this person's situation is, wow.
Yeah, I think it's also when we look at other people and we judge them, it's always a form of judging ourselves as well. So we tend to see bad stuff in other people that we really hate about ourselves. So you're making yourself small by judging other people because you for the most part judge only those parts that you dislike about yourself, not necessarily the parts that you don't consider being a part of your being.
It's kind of linked to projecting, which a lot of people will do. They'll project those aspects they don't like about themselves onto someone else, oftentimes as part of a personal attack. So say they're not secure about their own appearance and the way they present themselves, they'll attack other people's appearance as a way of distracting from their own process of self-loathing.
Yeah. And so I think if trying not to be judgmental, whether it is about yourself or about other people, it goes into it basically results in you not being as judgmental about yourself. So it's always we're always coming from this sense of we being the subject, and whether we judge others or ourselves, it's always a form of judging that will reflect on ourselves. So trying not to judge people is a good way to approach things. But when you judge, just take it as an opportunity to learn from it rather than to talk shit about people.
Yep. So based on the pacing of how we're taking this, like reading and discussing each one, how are you doing on time and energy?
Well, it's 1:30, so it's already pretty late here.
Because we could do a two-part for this, if you would prefer that. I'm just trying to be mindful of your energy because I know it's late for you.
Yeah, I think that wouldn't be the worst idea.
Okay.
Then I can put a bit more into government because I didn't flesh that one out as well because I realized that it's gonna be a lot to do in one sitting.
Mm-hmm. Sweet. So we could finish maybe the Xuanzi.
All right, sounds good to me.
Cool.
How are we doing on time though? When like 2 hours now?
Yes.
Yeah. For me to get a sense on how much, because it's difficult. I just look for what I deem worthy to talk about and write all of that down and then cut out the things that are not as important. But I felt for Confucius, he makes some really interesting distinctions on how to look at things, and it's a lot more. I think it's more difficult to talk about Confucius' idea than it is to talk about the Tao Te Ching, even though the Tao Te Ching is a lot more elusive. But it's just one concept that we're discussing, where here it's all these different concepts that kind of play into each other.
It's more instructional as well, I think, where with the Tao Te Ching you can almost capture the essence, even if you don't fully understand the essence. You can basically tell its nature in some vague capacity, whereas this is a lot more scripted rules of, in this situation you should do this, in that situation you should do that, which I think takes more time to just move through for the purpose of getting the gist of it. So 4.24, the gentleman wishes to be slow to speak, but quick to act. I like the slow to speak. I think that's a tough reminder, especially for Twitch chat. I'm not personally attacking anyone, but some people will just hammer out a bunch of different lines, and sometimes that's going to be bogging down what could be really good conversation. We have a good chat culture here on this page. Some of them, it's impossible to have any form of conversation because it just goes so fast, because everyone's encouraged to just spam the first thing that comes into their mind. That can be fun sometimes, but it also is very limiting. So being able to be efficient with your communication and think twice before you hit the enter key, sometimes adjusting your message, making it more concise, or starting over afresh if it's bad.
Yeah, and this kind of goes against the notion that I talked about before, that someone that reacts quickly and says something confidently has the better impact than someone that takes some time to speak about something. But if you're the kind of person that doesn't speak much, and whenever you open your mouth, something meaningful is coming out, that can have a huge impact.
Yeah, I noticed that with some people in the chat. You'll not see them for a while, and then something really witty will pop up, and it's just like, yes! You get a little bit more wind up with that, and then it's really good. So there is a balance too. Like, you do want to represent yourself, and it's nice to just be social and feel free to talk. I want people to feel safe and comfortable to just engage in conversation and stuff. And you're not being graded on what you say, but it is its own process of an awareness of the space that you take up in the chat and making that really high quality. I try to do the same thing too with my words, where I can be running my mouth constantly. If I can increase the value of each sentence as I'm going, then that makes it a much more enjoyable experience for you to watch.
Yeah. So 7.33, which is a self-critical assessment of Confucius. To some degree, bit humble or not so humble. So there is no one who is my equal when it comes to cultural refinement. But as for actual becoming a gentleman in practice, this is something that I have not been able to achieve. So there's no equal to him in terms of cultural refinement, which is basically that he is the person that has read the most and knows the most about all the ancient things. But trying to become a gentleman is something that he is still struggling with. Which is, yeah, he's both balls to the wall, but also humble in one sentence, which is a nice twist.
It's almost like he's giving himself a backhanded compliment. Kind of. He's saying, well, I'm not the best at this, but I am the best at that. It's like, well, everyone is a little bit silly, I think, and you can get a lot of good ideas from Confucius, but yeah, he definitely had some ego to him. I think that's part of the difference too between Lao Tzu and Confucius that we did see with the video. You got that captured a little bit, where Confucius is more woven into the culture of humans on Earth, as opposed to focusing more on that detachment from the material world, which I would guess with Buddha, we're going to focus on that a lot more.
Yeah. One interesting thing here is Confucius had a student whose name I'm gonna butcher. His name was Yan Hui. Yan Hu. Yeah, that doesn't matter. Basically, it was his prime student, and he really loved the guy. And Yan Hui, he died at an early age, being around 30, 35-ish. We don't really know what age he died, but basically this was a huge loss for Confucius because he considered him to be the kind of gentleman he was looking for in other people. So he was the prime example of how to be a good gentleman, more so than Confucius was himself. And this was really something that also comes up in a lot of the Analects, was basically Confucius dealing with the death of him and how we're missing a good role model now.
Either you die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Some Batman quotes.
This reminds me of another quote that somehow didn't make it into my list. Confucius said that seeing the Tao put into practice in the morning, he could die happily in the evening. So basically, knowing how things should be and being able to see this put into practice in the morning, he could die happily in the evening, is a really beautiful quote and informs a lot about how ambitious he was about really helping people, not becoming famous in the process.
Mm-hmm. Well, this next one. 918. I've yet to meet a man who loves virtue as much as he loves female beauty. Wow. So this, to me, jumps out as the difference between natural urges and practiced refinement. Because virtue, oftentimes, you have to gain the knowledge of what it is, and then you have to think about how that applies to you, and then you have to drill that into yourself in a form of behavior and action and speech. Whereas the response of perceiving female beauty and then having that influence your behavior is a lot more basic in terms of its kind of human animal response. And when is the critical point? He's basically saying there's no critical point where your practice of virtue would supersede that.
Yeah, it's also just an informed opinion about how we always struggle with basically human nature as something that we need to tune down in order to be virtuous. But it can be difficult to love virtue as much as female beauty. I tend to agree with that.
Yo, virtue is good, but ladies be pretty. Yeah,
12.4, and this is a bit of a longer one that I cut down to make it nice and smooth. But basically, it's a back and forth about what it means to be a gentleman. And Confucius said, well, a gentleman is free of anxiety or fear. And then they need an explanation for that. And he says, if you can look inside yourself and find no faults, what cause is there for anxiety or fear? So if you can reflect on your person and you see no faults, you don't have reason for anxiety or fear. Therefore, a good gentleman doesn't have anxiety or fear.
Yeah. Well, he was saying that he still has faults too, so this seems kind of like a hypothetical that
Yeah.
isn't really achievable, but I think the partial aspect you can have is the fewer faults you have within yourself, the fewer cases you have for anxiety or fear. So self-improvement means less anxiety and fear over the long term.
Yeah, I think unity is an ideal that is not achievable, but it's something to strive towards.
Mm-hmm. And the last one here, the gentleman is ashamed to have his words exceeded his actions. Yep. We've talked about this, I think, in one of the previous segments, the statement that I'm a nice guy or that I'm a good person and how problematic that is, where your goodness and your virtue and things like that should be so obvious to everyone else that they shouldn't need to be stated, especially not by you.
Yeah, if you have to say that, you're either making something up, or you're really insecure and need the what would you call that? Basically, need someone to compliment you on. Yeah, you are really that nice or that smart, which is can be fair at times, but I think you shouldn't necessarily do it with someone you don't know as much. I think you should have friends for that, and they should know you for who you are, and you don't have to state, well, I'm this really nice, smart person. But yeah, it basically comes back to the notion of putting things into action and showing who you are rather than talking about it, because there's little value in words if the actions don't follow.
Mm-hmm. Makes them hollow. Not really
Yeah.
living. Becomes a hand-waving gesture at that point.
Exactly.
So, Star, your question here, I think, ties with the underlying tone. We talked about this a little bit at the beginning. Where's the rebellion in all this? There's obedience in the old rites. I don't feel like it's very translatable. This, as a Western perspective reader, is very different in terms of its value of tradition. Like Eche Fatum was saying before, this is a conservative kind of political stance on society, and it was Angelic who was saying that you can see why this stood the test of time, because it's very helpful for the rulers to have a very obedient and respectful citizenry who value the structures that are in place and the status quo, so they don't challenge them. So if you say challenging the status quo is virtuous, then you create an unstable society where people are revolting and protesting and making your life difficult as a ruler. Whereas with this idea set, to obey the rules is seen as virtuous. You don't have as many uprisings you have to deal with, and that's part of why this stood the test of time so effectively, and part of why China has been as stable as it has as a continuous civilization.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to put it. And I think can be virtue in rebellion too, but it's difficult. I think we tend to look out for our own interest whenever we try to change something about society. And doing things for yourself is, for the most part, not virtuous. So there is virtue in not trying to change things. I think that's a fair thing to say. Although I tend to agree that society got to the point where we need to make changes and can't just look to the how the sage kings did things, because there's new problems arising that we can't always fix by looking back.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not necessarily a rebellion. It's just a form of adapting to a new set of circumstances.
Yep. Everything is a remix has been said before, where oftentimes the basic principles are the same, but the ways that we need to apply them and mold them into our modern era are different.
Yeah. Yeah, but Confucius was definitely not someone that would have talked for or would have voted for a rebellion. He was trying to keep things stable, and for the most part, rebellion is not a stable thing to do. Even though it can be better afterwards, but the process of a rebellion in ancient China would mean that a lot of people would starve to death because the irrigation project would not finish in time for the next harvest.
People gotta
And
eat.
there's and basically, if you had a bad ruler, you had the mandate of heaven taking care of them getting replaced at some point. But yeah, as Angelic said, it is a pretty neat system to keep the normal person down and not trying to rebel against the system. Basically, everything is already taken. Yeah, everything is taken care of. Heaven will take care that the right ruler will be put into place, and you just have to abide by the traditions, and everything will become good.
Well, cool. This is a pretty good stopping point, I think, for you to get some rest. It's also a nice digestible amount. So we have tradition and ritual and government ahead in this. And you said you wanted to flesh out some more stuff in government.
Yeah, just want to say a couple of things about this. So basically, tradition and ritual, it's about how since we learn by studying, by gathering knowledge on how to become good people, and being able to learn how to do a tea ceremony or how to do any of the Confucius rites in the proper manner informs how good of a student you are and how good you can put things into practice. So that it really ties back into the notion of learning, and it ties back into the notion of the relationship, since you learned certain rights from your ancestors. So that will be that, and since we'll have some more time on the next stream, I'll look up some funny things they did back in the time and what directions you had to face when you did this or that. So they had really, I'm not want to say weird traditions, but it was so strict, and it was like how they set up the rules for that was something interesting to look into. And for the government part, it is basically how all of the above inform about how a leader should be. And this informed how government was done in ancient China up until the 19th century, how meritocracy came to being, how there's the state exams where you filter society for the smart and virtuous people and set them into government, and what there is to be learned about having people with good virtues rule a country, which is something that we kind of forgot about or never really had in Western society.
As an American, I feel personally attacked.
I'm not gonna.
Yeah, we don't need to go there. We're currently working on that. We'll see. We'll see where it goes. But yeah, this was fun. I like the interaction with the chat. It seemed like you had the chat open this time.
Yeah, I can look at it ever so often. I tend not to read everything because it is pretty distracting for me. But whenever we're kind of in between things, I can take a short look to see what's happening.
Cool. Well, I'll give you another little shout out here in the chat, but this was a really nice discussion. It's always a pleasure having you on. This will be on YouTube fairly shortly. I'll highlight it after today's stream, so it'll be in the highlights even if I don't export it straight away. And then we will schedule the Confucius Part 2 to wrap this up soon.
All right. I'm going to put the new name since I changed my Twitch name. The link changed as well.
All right.
I noticed that, which is unfortunate.
Are you changing the command now? Or you're the VIP? I don't think you can.
I can't. Just gonna.
There you go.
And then I misspelled it. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was a real pleasure.
Hope you sleep well.
I definitely will.
And have the most virtuous dreams you physically can.